This happened a long time ago when I was approximately 13. My family and I were on vacation in Cape May, New Jersey. It had stormed the night before, and I remember being excited for some body surfing because somebody at the hotel had mentioned that the waves were larger than normal. We arrived at the beach, set up camp, and my younger brother and I rushed into the freezing cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean. For the first 30 minutes it was great. The waves tossed and turned us as planned. A pain, however, had started to form in my swimsuit. At first, I attributed it to the cold water. As any man can tell you, cold water not only causes shrinkage, but it can also make those things ache a bit. I decided that I just needed to get acclimated, and I continued enjoying the waves. After another 15 minutes or so, the pain became more acute. This time, with my arms concealed underwater, I inspected what was going on down there. As I poked around, I discovered sand and debris had collected at the bottom of my swimsuit's netting. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I cleared out the debris and continued to attribute the pain to the cold. About 10 more minutes pass, and my nuts are throbbing in pain at this point. Cold water has never had this effect on me in my short life. With my back to the shore, I performed a visual inspection. Everything looked fine, and so I cleared out some more debris, but upon doing this, I noticed a pebble that I must have missed. I grabbed it and a pain shot through my entire body. This was no pebble. It was a clam, and it had an iron grip on the bottom of my you-know-what. I remembered hearing jokes about fish mistaking something for a worm, but the thought of a clam with the taste for barnacles was a horror that I never could have imagined. I am now in a state of panic. I grab my brother and tell him that we've got to go. I rush out of the water and tell my parents the same thing. At first, they protested that they had only just arrived, but I insisted that we had to leave now, and they realized that something was wrong. I'm in such a frenzy that I almost demanded to be taken directly to the emergency room. The thought of explaining my plight to a receptionist dissuaded me, though. My parents pepper me with questions on our long walk back to the hotel. Did you see something or get stung by a jellyfish? I found it hard to articulate my shame. I'm at an awkward age when everything is embarrassing, let alone having a clam latched to your manhood. My concern trumps my humiliation, and I describe what has happened, or is happening. My parents are concerned, and my younger brother is crying, with laughter. The pain had only gotten worse as we entered a hotel. I rushed into the bathroom, locked the door, stripped off my suit, and finally got my first good look at the source of my pain. It was dark brown, oval-shaped, and a little bigger than a quarter, and it had an iron grip. Every time that I touched it, I felt waves of pain. The knocks of my parents at the door and the sound of my brother laughing echoed throughout the bathroom. My parents wanted to come in to see it, but my shame would not allow it. I told them that I couldn't get the clam off and I didn't know what to do. So I started to consider the emergency room again. Finally, my mom sent my dad to a nearby pharmacy to get some rubbing alcohol. They passed it through to me and I filled up a glass. I sat in that bathroom with my clam dangling in a glass of rubbing alcohol for at least 10 minutes. The clam never fully gave up its prize, and I think the alcohol weakened its resolve. So with a quick, extremely painful tug, I was finally free. My sack had a minor laceration that bled but was otherwise fine. Even after the events of that summer, I still love the ocean. But beware. Sometimes that ache below is more than just the cold. This horror story happened over 5 years ago. Looking back on it, it's hilarious, but it was terrifying at the time. It was a Wednesday evening when one of my best friends, I'll call him Rob, had called. His fiancée was out of town on Friday and wouldn't be back until late Saturday, and he wanted to know if I would like to spend the night at his place. At this point in our lives, we were both in our late 20s with full-time jobs. and we lived in separate towns 2 hours apart with our respective fiancés. We rarely got to hang out, so I excitedly agreed. We had grown out of the bar scene but still wanted to get into some trouble, so we settled on tripping on mushrooms, which we had both previously done a handful of times. I had recently read that the famous writer Terence McKenna recommended that users take a heroic dose or 5 grams on an empty stomach to get the full experience. For those unfamiliar, this is a very large dose. I asked Rob if he'd be up for that, and he readily agreed. At this point, I think the most that I had taken at once was a little over 3 grams, and probably the same for Rob. The night before our visit, I procured the mushrooms, ground them up, and filled empty pill capsules with the grounds. I really don't like the taste. The next day, I got stuck at work later than I had hoped and didn't arrive at Rob's until around 10 p.m. We weren't going to let a little delay stop us though, so we each downed our heroic doses and tossed back a few more pills for good measure. In total, we probably took close to around 6.5 grams. Over the course of the next hour, the effects of the cyclopin became apparent. The walls appeared to breathe, there were a few giggles, and I specifically recall his speckled granite countertop swirling and eventually appearing to melt and drip over the edge. It was around this time that one of us suggested going on a walk. Rob lived in a quiet suburb of a large Midwest city. His apartment building was part of a large complex that was located right off of the town's main street. Think brick road, colonial buildings, coffee shops, boutiques, small restaurants, and so on. It's not a party area, and by the time that we departed, it was a ghost town. The walk started pleasant enough as we took in the beauty of our surroundings. Soon we noticed a cop seemed to be following us, eventually pulling into an empty parking lot with his lights pointed at us. This agitated both of us, but we continued on until we got to a busy intersection with a long crosswalk that was close to a highway off-ramp. The goal was the gas station on the other side. The mushrooms, however, would not let me cross the street. My feet were sinking into the sidewalk, and I feared the walk signal wouldn't give us enough time to safely make it across. I turned back the way that we came, but took a right down a side street to get away from the cop. The side street intersected with train tracks that Rob said were a shortcut back to his place. We started on the berm of the tracks until thick, thorny shrubbery on both sides forced us onto the tracks. A minute later, the sound of a train's horn echoed in the distance. 2 druggies die on tracks, is what the reporting would say, I had imagined, as I started running, imploring Rob to do the same, until I reached another street. Confused, Rob watched me as he stood there. There was no train, of course. He encouraged me to keep going, assuring me the tracks were safe, and that we were a minute from his place. I wasn't getting back on the track, so we ended up taking another way, delaying our journey by another 5 minutes, which annoyed Rob. We finally arrived back at his place and all appeared to be fine. It had been over 2 hours from consumption. Despite our little misadventure, I was still having a positive trip. I'm sitting on Rob's couch as it slowly consumes me. I'm peaking and I feel great. But this was not the case for Rob. At this point, I should probably add some additional context for the events that follow. Rob hadn't slept well the night before and had taken somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 milligrams or more of Adderall throughout the day. He probably wasn't in the best set, as they say, for a heroic dose. Within 15 minutes of arriving back at his place, as I'm reaching for higher planes of existence, Rob was being dragged down below. He started acting strangely, muttering something about surveillance. He began frantically going around his apartment, unplugging all of his electronics, his TV, Alexa, computer, so on. I thought that he was doing a bit at first and found it funny, but then I noticed he was beet red and sweating. He complained about how hot it was. It wasn't hot at all. He guzzled an entire bottle of water and then another, and then he rolled up his sleeves and situated himself under the air conditioning register in his hallway, all the while saying nonsensical, dark things. I'm sitting on his sofa watching all of this, tripping my balls off, not knowing what to make of it. Part of me still thought it was a bit. Maybe he was trying to freak me out for delaying our journey back. Rob's a sweet guy, but he's not above some dark humor. Suddenly, Rob collapsed, smacking his head on the corner of a wall. I leapt up and ran to him, and I tried pulling him up, but he's much heavier than I am. I'm shouting, Robbie, are you good? But he's not responding. His eyes were glazed over, and my heart was in my stomach, and for a moment I feared the worst. 15 seconds go by and he comes to. His eyes dart around the room. He touches the back of his head and realizes that he's bleeding. He's hysterical, screaming that he's not going to make it. So somehow in my frame of mind, I call an ambulance and Rob is taken to the hospital. The next day, Rob ends up being fine, but he has to explain everything to his fiancée, who isn't very happy. Plus, the worst part of it was the hospital bill. And despite this experience, I still take the occasional mushroom, and most of my experiences have been very positive. I believe that everybody should have a psychedelic experience at least once in their life, responsibly. For those who haven't, the importance of set and setting cannot be overstated. Make sure that you're well rested in a good mind space and in a comfortable surrounding. And it's never a bad idea to have a sober friend with you, especially if you're taking a large dose.